So here we are in Whitehall, the centre of London. Welcome to another episode of Untold London, and today I'm going to take you down to Downing Street. Downing Street, named after Sir George Downing. Sir George Downing was a bit of a dodgy fella. He was a property speculator. Now, he'd fought for the parliamentarians in the English Civil War, but then worked for Charles II. Charles II sent him to Holland as a diplomat, and he was so badly behaved, he actually kick-started the Second Dutch War. He was sent out of Holland with his tail between his legs, and Charles II actually imprisoned him for a little while for a leave of absence, for leaving his post. So Sir George Downing, after fleeing Holland and being imprisoned by Charles II, came out of jail and became a property speculator. And he bought a piece of land just here. Now, it was quite marshy, it was quite sodden. Actually, Henry VIII had used it as a tennis court. You can imagine how bad he was at playing tennis on a soggy, marshy land. And Sir George Downing built a parade of houses. Now, 1720, the Crown Estate buy it, okay? Crown Estate take it over, and in 1732, Sir Robert Walpole became Prime Minister. Now, he was actually the UK's first real Prime Minister. Before then, they'd all been called the Lord Chief of the Treasury. But he was known as a Prime Minister, and it was actually used as a term of abuse because people thought he was a bit of a bootlicker. He'd got George II a £100,000 increase in the annual civil list, and so he was called the Prime Minister because he was the King's best mate. So after Sir Robert Walpole had moved in, he said to the Crown Estate, right, I'll live here, or I'll use it for my offices as long as my successor can. And so it became a tradition that if you were the Prime Minister, you'd have access to number 10. Now, as I said, it was built on quite soggy and marshy land, and also Mr. George Downing was a bit of a fly-by-night, a bit of a budget and scarper person. And so by the 1800s, it was falling down. Disraeli and Gladstone had to spend a fortune propping up number 10. Now, it wasn't until 1902 that Sir Arthur Balfour, who was the Prime Minister then, actually moved in, and he created a flat in the attic, and it then became the tradition for the Prime Ministers to live on site, above the shop as it were. Now, when we walk in, and we are going to go in a minute, when we go in you might see the actual sign saying number 10, and the 0 is slightly wonky. The reason why is because our friend Sir George Downing was such a fly-by-night budget and scarper builder that when he put the 10 up, it went to one side and he never fixed it. And so, to keeping with the tradition, the 0 on the 10 is always slightly a few degrees to the right. So we're actually in the queue to get into number 10 because, you know, Untold London does have access to all areas. Now, Margaret Thatcher, one of her favourite hobbies was interior design, and while she lived at number 10, she spent quite a lot of time doing it up. And now there's a room there called the terracotta room, and the cornicing, she had the cornicing replaced, and she got a plaster maker to create an image of a man carrying a straw bale of hay, who was a Ruth Thatcher, and that remains there today. So the last private resident to live at number 10 before Sir Robert Walpole was a man named Mr. Chicken.
Cheerio, lovely to meet you.
Lovely to meet you. See you inside.
You have a seat inside.
Here we are in Downing Street. Now, as you can see, it's got a black facade, but actually Downing Street was originally built in something called London yellow stock brick, but the soot and pollution had turned the bricks black, so eventually they decided, why not just paint the facade black to hide all the horrible smog and pollution. And the famous black door actually for a while was green. Herbert Asquith, elected Liberal Prime Minister at the turn of the 20th century, his wife was a bit of a socialite and she thought it was a bit too dull, so she got out a can of paint and painted it green, and it remained that way for 10 years. Okay, so Downing Street has been home to some popular and unpopular residents, but there's one resident that always seems to melt the heart, and that is the cats of Downing Street. The building's always had a bit of a problem with rats and vermin, I'm afraid. Ramsay MacDonald, Labour Prime Minister, elected 1924. He was the first person to bring a cat in to Downing Street to deal with the mice. He had a cat called Rufus, and his nickname was Treasury Bill, and he lasted till 1930. Then in 1930 a tradition started that cats who came to live in Downing Street would be called Peter. There were 4 cats called Peter who've lived here in the 20th century, although Winston Churchill broke that tradition briefly in the 1940s when he brought his own cat along, who happened to be called Nelson. After Peter IV, died in 1970. Sorry. Oh. Okay, so after the monk called Peter IV died in 1970, a new cat was brought in, and his name was Wilberforce, obviously named after William Wilberforce, the slave abolitionist. Now, Wilberforce's tenure would do any Prime Minister proud. He stayed there from 1970 to 1987. Quite a long run, hey? He was followed by Sybil, named after, I think, probably Basil Fawlty's missus. And also following Sybil, there was one called Humphrey the cat, which must have come from the Humphrey character in Yes Minister.
Would that be all, Minister?
So when Winston Churchill took over from Neville Chamberlain in 1940, he moved into number 10. The Blitz had started, and Winston Churchill would climb to the top of the roof here and watch the bombers come over. Now, the anti-aircraft guns would only go off when they spotted a plane and had it in their sights. And he sent a message to the Home Defence Unit saying, no, I want you blazing away in the sky, even if you can't see a German bomber, because it's so much better for morale to have fireworks woofing up. Now, Downing Street was quite a run-down and decrepit building, and the basement had very shallow foundations, so it wasn't a great place for a bomb shelter. So they moved over to became known as the War Cabinet Rooms, which is in Story Gate by St James's Park. But Winston would always come back and sleep at number 10, partly because it had a more comfortable bed and it was better for the country's morale to know he was in situ. At one point, he was moved to a place called Down Street Tube, which was by Piccadilly Circus, and it was a defunct tube station. They had two big tube tunnels, and they fitted it out with luxury accommodation for visiting dignitaries. But Winston Churchill found it quite claustrophobic. His bath still remains there. Now, after the war, Clement Attlee beats Churchill, he moves out, but he comes back in 1951 when the Tories won that general election. And he had this rule that his private secretary was never allowed to disturb his sleep at the weekends. Nothing could wake him up. You wait for me to wake up on a Sunday morning, you bring in my breakfast, you bring in my eggs and beans and chips and stuff, and serve me up. Don't wake me up until I'm ready. One morning, the private secretary goes into Winston Churchill's bedroom up here and says, "You've got to wake up, sir, you've got to wake up. Wake up." Winston Churchill wakes up and goes, "What is it, war with Russia? What's going on?" Private Secretary said, "I've got some really bad news, sir. I'm afraid one of your backbenchers has been caught in a compromising position with a Coldstream Guard in St James's Park, and the news of the world have found out, and it's splashed all over the newspapers." Winston Churchill pauses for a moment. "It was quite cold last night, wasn't it?" The Private Secretary said, "Yeah, I think it was like a -1. Churchill pauses again. "Makes you proud to be British."